He heard no from a black woman, and it broke something in him. Eugene Park lived in a world where resistance didn't exist. In Seoul, his name moved markets. Investors adjusted their strategies at the mere hint of his interest. Employees stood straighter when he passed, their voices tightening with careful respect. Women smiled a little longer, lingered a little closer, hoping to be noticed by a man who seemed carved from precision and control. He didn't chase anything. Everything came to him. Success, power, attention, compliance. So when his private jet touched down in Los Angeles, it wasn't for leisure. It was for acquisition. A quiet but massive deal that would extend his company's reach deeper into the American tech space. Efficient, strategic, predictable, just the way he liked it. But power, for all its certainty, had a way of breeding boredom. And that morning, something felt off. His assistant had scheduled back-to-back meetings at a luxury hotel downtown, but Eugene waved them off with a single, dismissive gesture. "I'll go later," he said, voice calm but final. The assistant hesitated. "Sir, the investors." "We'll wait." They always did. Instead, he stepped out onto the street alone. No security detail, no entourage. Just him, wrapped in a tailored charcoal coat, blending into a city that didn't yet know who he was. For once, he wanted to feel anonymous. He walked without direction, the rhythm of the city unfamiliar but strangely grounding. Cars rushed past. Strangers brushed shoulders without apology. Conversations overlapped in a language that felt faster, looser than the controlled tones he was used to. It was refreshing. That's how he found the cafe. It wasn't impressive. No sleek branding. No velvet ropes or curated exclusivity. Just warm light spilling through wide windows, the soft hum of espresso machines, and the low murmur of people existing without pretense. He almost kept walking, but something about it pulled him in. Inside, the air smelled like roasted coffee beans and quiet ambition. Writers, students, freelancers, people building something, not commanding it. Eugene paused just inside the door. For a moment, no one noticed him. It was a strange sensation. Then, gradually, heads turned. A woman behind the counter blinked twice before offering a slightly flustered smile. A couple near the window whispered to each other, eyes flickering in his direction. A man in line adjusted his posture, instinctively making space. Recognition without knowing. Presence without introduction. There it was again, his gravity. Eugene ordered a simple black coffee, his voice low, measured. Even here, even now, people responded to him in subtle ways. Faster service, softer tones, unconscious deference. It followed him everywhere. Everywhere except one place. He noticed her without trying. She sat in the far corner, tucked beside the window where sunlight painted soft gold across her skin. A laptop open in front of her, fingers moving with quiet confidence across the keys. A notebook lay beside her, filled with handwritten thoughts, messy, alive, real. Her hair was pulled into a natural bun, curls catching the light. No excessive makeup. No performative elegance. Just presence. But what caught him wasn't her beauty. It was her indifference. She hadn't looked up once. Not when he walked in. Not when the room shifted. Not even when a chair scraped loudly nearby. It was as if his existence had no effect on her world. Eugene found himself staring. Not in admiration. In confusion. He was not used to being unseen. Something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Curiosity, sharp and insistent. Before he could rationalize it, his feet were already moving. He walked toward her table, each step measured, controlled, but internally, something was slightly off balance. Up close, she felt even more grounded. Real. Untouched by the invisible currents he was used to controlling. He stopped beside her table. Still, she didn't look up. For a brief second, he hesitated. That alone was unprecedented. Then he spoke. "Is this seat taken?" His voice was calm, smooth, the kind that usually opened doors and softened refusals before they formed. Her fingers paused, just for a second. Then she looked up. Their eyes met. And in that moment, something shifted. Her gaze wasn't impressed, wasn't curious. wasn't intimidated. It was neutral,
Clear. Direct.
unmoved. She took him in, his tailored coat, his posture, the quiet authority he carried, and then dismissed it all in a single breath. Yes, she said. No hesitation. No apology. Then she looked back down at her screen and continued typing, as if the conversation had already ended. Eugene didn't move,
Didn't speak.
didn't process. Because that single word, that simple, effortless no, landed harder than any rejection he had ever experienced. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't attitude. It was certainty. And for the first time in his life, Eugene Park stood in front of someone who had no intention of bending for him. The noise of the cafe faded, the world narrowed, and something deep inside him, something built over years of control, power, and unquestioned dominance,
Cracked.
just slightly, but enough to change everything. The word lingered longer than it should have. Yes. Simple. Final. Unapologetic. Eugene remained standing beside her table, the faint hum of the cafe slowly returning around him.
Cups clinked.
Milk steamed. Conversations resumed. Life moved on. But he didn't. Because something about the way she said it didn't fit into any category he understood. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't flirtatious. It wasn't even dismissive in a cruel way. It was resolved. As if his presence had been evaluated and quietly declined. He glanced at the empty chair across from her, then back at her. I don't see anyone sitting there, he said, his tone still controlled, still polite, but with a thread of something new beneath it. Challenge. Arya didn't look up this time. Her fingers continued moving across the keyboard, steady, unhurried. I'm working, she replied.
A beat.
Alone. Another beat. That's intentional. Each sentence landed like a closed door. Not slammed. Just firmly shut. Eugene felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Most people, when confronted with his presence, adjusted themselves, made room, softened their tone, left space for him to exist comfortably. She did the opposite. She reinforced her boundaries. And she did it without even looking at him. He should have walked away. Any reasonable man, any version of himself from yesterday would have. But something in him resisted. Not out of ego alone, but out of a growing need to understand. So he stayed. You don't even know who I am, he said. It wasn't a boast. It was instinct. A truth he had relied on his entire life. Because knowing who he was usually changed everything. This time, it changed nothing. Arya stopped typing. Slowly, she closed her laptop, as if acknowledging that the conversation now required her full attention, not because he deserved it, but because she chose to give it. She looked up at him again. Those same calm, steady eyes. No, she said. A slight tilt of her head. I don't. There was no sarcasm. No hidden curiosity. Just honesty. Then, after a brief pause, she added, and I don't need to. That was the moment it happened. Not loud. Not dramatic.
But deep.
Something inside Eugene shifted in a way he couldn't immediately name. Because for the first time in years, his identity held no weight, no leverage, no advantage. It was like offering currency in a place where money didn't exist. Useless. He studied her more carefully now, not as a man observing a woman, but as someone trying to solve something unfamiliar. Most people would at least pretend to be interested, he said. Her lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest amusement. I'm not most people. There it was again. Not arrogance. Not rebellion. Just fact. Unshaken. Eugene exhaled slowly, his composure still intact, but his thoughts no longer as precise as they once were. Then what kind of person are you? He asked. This time, she did smile. Small. Subtle. Real. The kind that doesn't owe strangers access to my time, she said. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that forced reflection. Eugene had spent his entire life taking up space, entering rooms, conversations, lives, without ever needing permission, because no one ever denied him. Until now. He glanced around the cafe briefly, as if grounding himself in something familiar. But nothing felt the same. When he looked back at her, his voice had shifted, just slightly. Less certain. Less automatic. "So that's it?" he asked. "A simple no?" Arya held his gaze. "Yes," she said. A pause. Then softer, but no less firm. "That's enough." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything he wasn't used to feeling. Uncertainty. Awareness. Something uncomfortably close to vulnerability. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Arya reopened her laptop, her attention already returning to her work. Conversation over. Decision made. Boundary intact. And just like that,
He was dismissed.
not harshly, not cruelly, but completely. Eugene stood there a second longer than he should have. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Back to the counter. Back to his untouched coffee. Back to a version of himself that suddenly felt incomplete. He picked up the cup, but didn't drink. Instead, his eyes drifted back to her. She hadn't looked up again. Hadn't reconsidered. Hadn't second-guessed herself. She simply continued living her life, unaffected. And that's when he realized something that unsettled him more than rejection ever could. She hadn't rejected him. She had excluded him, as if he had never been an option to begin with. Eugene left the cafe shortly after. But the air outside felt different.
Sharper.
Quieter. The city moved the same, but he didn't. Because her words followed him. "I don't need to know who you are. That's enough." They echoed, not in his ears, but somewhere deeper. Somewhere that had never been challenged before. And for the first time in his life, Eugene Park didn't know how to respond. Not with power. Not with money. Not with control. Just silence. And the unfamiliar weight of a no that refused to bend. Eugene didn't remember the drive back. The city blurred past his window, glass towers, palm trees, flashing lights, but none of it registered. His driver spoke once, maybe twice. He didn't answer. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't calculating outcomes or anticipating moves. It was stuck. On her. On that moment. On a single word that shouldn't have mattered, but did. His penthouse sat high above the city, all glass and steel, designed to reflect power in its purest form. When he stepped inside, the silence greeted him like it always did. Clean, controlled, obedient. Usually it felt like peace.
Tonight it felt empty.
He loosened his tie, something he rarely did before the end of a structured day. His schedule still sat untouched on his phone. Meetings postponed, investors waiting, decisions delayed. All because of a conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes. It made no sense, and that frustrated him more than anything. Eugene poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the low light as he moved toward the window. The city stretched endlessly beneath him, alive, moving, responsive. A world that reacted. A world that answered. A world that, in one way or another, always said yes. He took a slow sip, then another. But the taste didn't ground him. It didn't settle the unease coiling quietly inside his chest. Instead, his thoughts drifted back. Again. And again. "I don't need to." He exhaled sharply, setting the glass down. Why did that matter? People had refused him before, competitors, negotiators, even governments at times. But those refusals came with resistance. Strategy. Fear. They meant something. They acknowledged him. They reacted to him. Arya hadn't. She hadn't resisted him. She hadn't challenged him. She had simply not included him. And that distinction, that quiet, almost effortless dismissal, unraveled something fundamental in him. Eugene ran a hand through his hair, pacing slowly across the room. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. It was a moment. A stranger. An insignificant interaction. So, why did it feel like a question he couldn't answer? He stopped walking. Because that was it. A question. One he had never needed to ask before. Who am I, all when none of this matters? His gaze drifted across the penthouse. The art, the architecture, the carefully curated perfection of a life built on control and achievement. Every piece of it had purpose. Every detail reinforced who he was. But suddenly, it all felt external. Like armor he had worn for so long, he had forgotten what was underneath. His phone buzzed. Once. Then again. Persistent. He glanced at the screen, his assistant. He let it ring out. Moments later, a message appeared. Sir, the investors are asking if the meeting will proceed tonight. Dujin stared at the words. Normally, he would have replied instantly.
Sharp.
Efficient. Decisive. Instead, he typed slowly. Reschedule. He hit send before he could reconsider. Another message came immediately. Understood. Tomorrow? He hesitated. Then,
No.
a pause. Next week. The typing bubble appeared, then disappeared. His assistant didn't question it. No one ever did. But even that obedience felt different now. He set the phone down and turned back to the window. The city still moved. Still responded. Still bent. But her voice cut through it all.
Calm. Steady. Certain.
Unaffected. That's enough. Dujin closed his eyes briefly. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something dangerously close to insignificance. Not because he lacked power, but because, in that moment, his power had meant nothing. Across the city, Arya Brooks sat on the small balcony of her apartment, her laptop closed beside her. The night air was cooler here. Quieter.
Real.
She leaned back in her chair, staring out at the distant lights, her thoughts slower than usual. She had finished her work hours ago, but something lingered.
Not heavy.
Not consuming. Just present. That interaction earlier, it had been simple.
Clear.
Necessary. Men like him weren't uncommon. Not in appearance, not in confidence. She had encountered enough of them to recognize the pattern instantly. Entitled access. Polished persistence. The assumption that presence alone was permission. So she had responded the way she always did.
Direct.
Respectful. Firm. No room for misinterpretation. And yet, she tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest, her brow furrowing just slightly. There had been something different about him, not in what he said, but in what he didn't. He hadn't pushed past her boundaries aggressively, hadn't tried to charm or manipulate his way in. He had paused, listened, even if he didn't fully understand. That was rare. She shook the thought away gently. It doesn't matter, she murmured to herself. And it didn't. Her life was full, intentionally so. Work she cared about. Space she protected. Peace she refused to compromise. One stranger at a cafe didn't change that. Couldn't change that. Still, for just a second, she remembered the look in his eyes when she said no. Not anger. Not offense. Something quieter. Something unsettled. Arya exhaled softly and stood, picking up her laptop. Whatever that moment had been, it was over. A closed chapter. She stepped inside, sliding the door shut behind her. Back in the penthouse, Dujin hadn't moved. The city lights reflected in his eyes, but his focus was elsewhere. Somewhere between who he had been that morning
and who he was now.
Because in the span of a few minutes, a stranger had done what no rival, no loss, no failure had ever managed to do. She hadn't defeated him, hadn't challenged him, hadn't even tried. She had simply shown him a world where he didn't automatically matter. And that realization, quiet, unavoidable, absolute, didn't just linger. It stayed, like silence after a question no one knows how to answer. And for the first time in his life, Dujin Park didn't try to fill it. He just stood there and felt it. The next morning, everything looked the same. And that was the problem. Dujin stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his penthouse, adjusting his cufflinks with the same precision he had practiced for years. Every movement was controlled. Every detail intentional. Impeccable. Untouchable. Unshaken. At least, that's how it appeared. But behind his reflection, something wasn't aligned. His eyes lingered on himself a second longer than usual. Not in admiration. In assessment. As if he were trying to see past the surface, and couldn't. He straightened his jacket anyway. Because that's what he did. He moved forward. By the time he arrived at his company's Los Angeles office, the world had returned to its usual rhythm around him. Assistants moved quickly. Executives stood when he entered. Voices sharpened. Postures adjusted. The room shifted.
Just like it always had.
Good morning, sir. Mr. Park, the revised projections are ready. We've secured preliminary approval from the board. He nodded, acknowledging everything without fully hearing it. Because beneath the surface of efficiency, there was static. A quiet disruption he couldn't switch off. He entered the conference room, taking his seat at the head of the table. Screens lit up. Data filled the walls. Numbers, clean, logical, predictable, flowed in structured presentations. This was his world, where everything made sense, where outcomes could be controlled. Based on our analysis, one executive began, the acquisition will increase market share by at least.
No.
The word slipped out before he processed it. The room froze. The executive blinked. Sir? Eugene leaned back slightly, his expression still calm, but his mind suddenly sharp in a different way. For a split second, he heard her voice.
Clear. Certain. No.
He exhaled slowly.
Continue, he said.
The presentation resumed, but something had shifted. Not in the room. In him. Because that word, no longer felt like resistance. It felt like clarity. And clarity forced him to look differently. He studied the projections on the screen. Margins. Expansion models. On paper. But suddenly, he wasn't asking, can we do this? He was asking something else. Why am I doing this? The question caught him off guard. He had never needed a why. Success had always been enough. Expansion had always been the goal. But now, that answer felt incomplete. Pause, he said. The room went silent again. Every eye on him, waiting, expecting direction. Eugene looked around the table at the people who depended on him for certainty, for answers, for control. And for the first time, he didn't have one ready. Why this company? He asked. The executives exchanged quick glances. Sir, someone responded carefully. This acquisition, he continued, his voice steady but quieter than usual. Why do we want it? Another pause. Then the expected answer came. Market dominance. Strategic positioning. Long-term profitability.
Correct.
Efficient. Empty. Eugene nodded slowly. Those are outcomes, he said. Not reasons. The room fell into a deeper silence. Because that distinction, it wasn't one he had ever made before. He stood, walking toward the window, his reflection faintly visible against the glass. For years, he had built his empire on outcomes. Winning, expanding, controlling. But standing there now, he realized something unsettling. He had never questioned the direction, only the execution. And suddenly, that didn't feel like enough. Restructure the proposal, he said finally. We'll revisit it later. No one argued. They simply nodded and adjusted. Because that's what they always did. They followed. And for the first time, that obedience didn't feel powerful. It felt isolating. The rest of the day followed the same pattern. Meetings, decisions, conversations, all handled with his usual precision. But internally, something was unraveling. Not loudly, quietly, like a thread being pulled, slowly loosening everything it was connected to. That evening, he found himself back in his penthouse again. But this time, he didn't go to the window. He didn't pour a drink. He didn't reach for his phone. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed,
Still.
unoccupied. And that alone felt foreign. His mind drifted, not to numbers or strategies, but to her, Arya. The way she had looked at him, not impressed, not intimidated, just present, as if she saw him and found nothing she needed. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Who am I? Oh, without any of it. The question returned, louder this time, more insistent, because, for the first time, he didn't have a shield against it. No title, no influence, just himself. And he didn't know if that was enough. That realization sat heavy in his chest. Not because it diminished him, but because it exposed something he had never had to confront. He had built everything around being needed, but not necessarily known. And Arya, without trying, had stripped all of that away in a single moment, leaving only the question behind. Across the city, Arya sat at her desk, reviewing her work with quiet focus. Her space was simple, intentional, everything she needed, nothing she didn't. She paused briefly, stretching her shoulders, her gaze drifting toward the window. For a fleeting moment, she thought of him again, not with curiosity, just recognition. There had been something in his eyes before he left, something unsettled, as if her no hadn't just been heard, it had been felt.
Deeply.
She tapped her pen lightly against the desk, then shook her head. "It's not my responsibility," she said softly to herself. And it wasn't. People carried their own weight, their own questions. She had simply set a boundary. What he did with it, that was his. Arya returned to her work, her focus steady once more. Back in the penthouse, Eugene lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. It rarely did when his mind was unsettled. But this wasn't stress. It wasn't pressure. It was awareness, unfamiliar, and quietly consuming, because something inside him had shifted, not broken completely, but cracked enough to let something new in.
Doubt. Possibility.
And, for the first time in his life, Eugene Park wasn't trying to fix it, wasn't trying to control it, wasn't trying to silence it. He just let it exist. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't something to overcome. It was something to understand. And that realization, more than power, more than success, more than anything he had built, was the beginning of a man he had never been before. A week passed. 7 days of structure, expectation, and routine. 7 days of meetings, decisions, and controlled outcomes. 7 days of trying, quietly, unsuccessfully, to return to who he had been. But something had changed. Not visibly. Not in a way anyone else could name. But Eugene felt it in the pauses between conversations, in the silence after decisions, in the moments when no one was watching. He was no longer moving on instinct alone. He was thinking. And that slowed everything down. On the 8th morning, he woke up before his alarm. Not because of urgency. Because of clarity. There was somewhere he needed to be. Not scheduled. Not required. Just chosen. He stood in front of his wardrobe, rows of tailored suits waiting, dark, precise, commanding. For a moment, his hand hovered over them. Then he moved past. He chose something simpler. A plain black sweater. Dark jeans. No watch. No cufflinks. No visible markers of who he was. For the first time in years, he dressed without intention to impress. The drive felt different this time. He noticed things he hadn't before. The rhythm of traffic, the uneven pacing of the city, the way people moved without calculation. Normal, unstructured, uncontrolled. He didn't check his phone, didn't review notes, didn't prepare. Because this time, there was nothing to prepare for. When he stepped into the cafe again, the bell above the door chimed softly. The same warmth greeted him, the same low hum of conversation. But this time, he didn't pause to be noticed. He didn't scan the room with quiet authority. He simply walked in, ordered his coffee, waited his turn, and moved aside. No one rushed him. No one adjusted. No one recognized him. And for once, that didn't feel like a loss. It felt honest. He saw her. Of course he did. Same corner. Same seat. Same quiet focus. Arya Brooks. Unchanged. Unaffected. Still completely within her own world. Eugene felt something shift in his chest. Not sharp this time. Not disruptive. Just steady. He didn't approach her. Didn't interrupt. Didn't test her boundaries again. Instead, he took a seat across the cafe. Alone. He placed his coffee on the table and pulled out a book he hadn't touched in years, something he used to read before his life became a series of outcomes instead of experiences. At first, the words didn't land. His attention drifted. Not to her directly, but to the awareness of her presence. He resisted the urge to look over. Resisted the instinct to act. Instead, he stayed where he was. Present.
Still.
For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to control the moment.
He was letting it exist.
Time passed. Minutes. Then more. The rhythm of the cafe wrapped around him, grounding him in a way his penthouse never could. And then, a shift. Subtle, but undeniable. He felt it before he saw it. A presence standing near his table. He looked up.
Arya.
She studied him briefly, her expression unreadable, but not closed. Not dismissive. Different. You came back, she said. Her voice held no judgment, just observation. Dujin closed his book slowly, meeting her gaze. I did.
A pause.
She glanced at his clothes, his posture, the absence of everything that had defined him before. Noticing, assessing. You didn't try to sit with me this time, she said. There was a hint of curiosity now. Not much, but enough. Dujin shook his head slightly. No, he replied. Why not? The question wasn't challenging. It was genuine, and that mattered. He considered his answer for a moment, not calculating, not crafting, just choosing honesty. Because you said no, he said simply. Arya held his gaze. And I heard you. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Real weight, not performance.
Not charm.
Understanding. That made her pause. Because most people didn't do that. Most people heard boundaries as obstacles. Something to work around. Something to negotiate. He hadn't. He had accepted it. And more than that, he had adjusted. She crossed her arms lightly, tilting her head. So why come back at all? Another fair question. Another moment without an easy answer. Dujin exhaled softly. I wasn't finished learning something, he said. Her brow lifted slightly. Learning what? He hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of unfamiliarity. This kind of conversation. It didn't have a script. How to exist somewhere I'm not in control, he said finally. Arya's expression shifted.
Subtly.
But noticeably. Because that answer, it wasn't what she expected. And this was the place for that? She asked. A faint hint of amusement touched her voice. Dujin allowed the smallest trace of a smile. It was the place it started. That landed. Not heavily, but clearly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them was intense. It wasn't awkward. It was open, unstructured, and strangely balanced. Arya glanced at the empty chair across from him, then back at him. You can sit with me, she said. The words were simple, but this time, they were an invitation. Not something taken, not something assumed.
Given.
Dujin looked at her for a second longer than necessary, as if recognizing the difference. Then he nodded once. Thank you. No entitlement. No expectation. Just acknowledgement. He stood, picking up his coffee and book, and followed her back to her table. This time, when he sat down, it meant something different. Up close, the energy had changed. Not entirely. She was still grounded, still self-contained. But there was space now. Small, careful, intentional. And he respected it. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't need to be filled immediately. Then Arya spoke. So, she said, leaning back slightly, what did you learn? Dujin looked at her, not as a challenge, not as a conquest, but as someone who had unknowingly shifted something fundamental in him. That I don't know how to just be, he admitted. The honesty surprised even him. But he didn't take it back. Arya studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Most people don't, she said. A pause. But most people don't realize it either. That stayed with him, because she was right. And for the first time, he wasn't ahead of the conversation. He was inside it.
Learning.
Listening.
Present.
The cafe continued around them, unchanged. But at that table, something had shifted. Not into romance. Not into certainty. But into something far more rare. Respect. And this time, it wasn't given because of who he was. It was given because of how he chose to show up. And that was something Dujin Park had never experienced before. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where Dujin Park became someone new. It unfolded quietly. Conversation by conversation. Silence by silence. Choice by choice. They didn't exchange numbers that first day. Didn't make plans.
didn't define anything.
And somehow, that made everything feel real. Because nothing was forced. Nothing was assumed. It just continued. Days turned into a rhythm. Not predictable, but consistent. Some mornings, Eugene would arrive at the cafe and find Arya already there, immersed in her work, a cup of coffee cooling beside her. Other days, she wouldn't come at all. And at first, that unsettled him. He wasn't used to uncertainty. He wasn't used to not knowing when he would see someone, or if he would at all. But he didn't text, didn't ask, didn't try to control it, because somewhere along the way, he understood something important. Access to her presence wasn't something he could demand. It was something she chose to give. And that changed how he showed up. When they did sit together, the conversations weren't grand. They were human. Arya asked questions no one had ever asked him before. Not because they were complicated, but because they required honesty. "What do you enjoy doing when no one's watching?" she asked one afternoon, her fingers wrapped loosely around her cup. Eugene didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know. The silence stretched. Uncomfortable.
Real.
"I don't know," he admitted finally. The words felt unfamiliar on his tongue. Arya nodded, not surprised. "Then that's a good place to start," she said. "No judgment. No pressure. Just direction." Another day, she asked, "What made you choose your life?" He almost gave the automatic answer: ambition, legacy, success. But something stopped him. Because those answers felt incomplete now. "I didn't choose it," he said slowly. "I built it." Arya tilted her head slightly. "That's not the same thing," she said. He frowned, considering that.
"How?"
"Choosing implies awareness," she replied. "Building can just be momentum." That stayed with him, because for the first time, he wondered if he had been moving forward his entire life, without ever stopping to ask where he actually wanted to go. It wasn't always comfortable. In fact, most of it wasn't. There were moments where Eugene felt exposed in a way no negotiation or boardroom had ever made him feel. One evening, the cafe was quieter than usual. Rain tapped softly against the windows, turning the outside world into a blur of motion and light. They sat across from each other, the air between them calm, but heavy with something unspoken. Arya watched him for a moment. "You're different," she said. Eugene looked up.
"How?"
"You listen now," she replied. A pause. "And you don't rush to fill the silence." He exhaled softly. "That's because I don't always know what to say." The honesty came easier now. Arya studied him, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you always need to know?" The question was simple, but it hit deeper than expected. Eugene leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting toward the rain-streaked glass. "For most of his life."
"Yes."
"I don't think so," he said quietly. And that was new. The biggest shift came the day he said it out loud. Across from her. "I don't know who I am without everything I've built." The words hung in the air. In any other setting, that kind of admission would have been dangerous. A crack in the image. A weakness to be exploited. But Arya didn't react that way. She just held the space.
"That's honest," she said.
A beat. "Now you get to find out." That felt more supportive than anything he had ever heard. Piece by piece, the man he had been began to shift. Not disappear, but loosen. The identity built entirely on external validation. It didn't vanish overnight, but it cracked, made room, allowed something else to exist. And in that space, Eugene began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. The taste of his coffee, when he wasn't distracted. The rhythm of conversations, when he wasn't steering them. The feeling of sitting still without needing to move forward. It was subtle, but it was real. Arya noticed it too. Not because he told her, but because it showed. In the way he paused before speaking. In the way he asked questions without expecting specific answers. In the way he respected her space without needing to be reminded. One afternoon, she watched him quietly for a moment before speaking. "You're not trying to impress me anymore," she said. Eugene glanced up, a faint smile touching his lips. "I don't think I ever could," he replied. There was no bitterness in it. Just acceptance. Arya smiled slightly. That's not the point, she said. He raised an eyebrow. Then what is? She leaned back in her chair, considering him. The point is, you stop trying. And that
was the shift.
because for the first time in his life, Eugene Park wasn't performing.
He was just there.
But growth doesn't come without tension. And the moment that tested everything came quietly, unexpectedly. One afternoon, after hours of conversation, Arya closed her laptop and stood. I won't be here for a while, she said. Eugene looked up. How long? A few weeks. The answer was calm, casual, but it landed heavier than expected. A few weeks. The old version of him reacted instantly. Ask why. Find a way to stay connected. But he didn't. He felt the impulse, recognized it, and let it pass. Instead, he nodded once. Okay. Arya watched him carefully, as if expecting something more. When it didn't come, she tilted her head slightly. That's it, she asked. Eugene met her gaze, steady. That's enough, he said. Her own words returned, but this time, they carried a different meaning. Not dismissal, understanding, and, for the first time, the no that had once unsettled him felt like something he could stand in, without breaking. As she walked away, Eugene didn't follow. He simply watched her go, not as something he was losing, but as someone he had never owned. And in that moment, he realized something quietly powerful. He wasn't afraid of the absence anymore, because what had changed in him, and that was the moment the man he had been, the one who needed control, certainty, and constant validation, finally began to let go. Not completely, but enough. Enough to make space for someone new. Someone who didn't need the world to say yes.
To feel whole.
And that was something no amount of power could ever buy. Time didn't rush. It stretched. Quietly, steadily, without asking for permission. The first few days after Arya left felt noticeable. The cafe still opened at the same hour. The same barista greeted customers with the same half-smile. The same sunlight filtered through the windows, touching the same tables. But her seat remained empty. And for the first time, Eugene understood what absence really meant. On the third day, he almost asked the barista about her. The question sat on his tongue. Do you know when she'll be back?
But he didn't say it.
Because he already knew the answer didn't belong to him. So instead, he ordered his coffee,
Sat down.
opened his book, and stayed. By the end of the first week, something shifted. The restlessness faded. The quiet became comfortable. He started noticing the rhythm of the place again, not as a backdrop to her presence, but as something valuable on its own. A student nervously rehearsing a presentation under his breath. A woman sketching designs in a notebook, lost in her own world. An older man reading the same newspaper every morning, turning each page with deliberate care. Life unfolding, unaffected. And for once, Eugene wasn't observing it from above.
He was part of it.
Back at work, the changes followed him. Not loudly, but undeniably. He listened more in meetings, not to respond, but to understand. He asked different questions. Not how fast or how much, but why and at what cost. At first, it unsettled his team. They weren't used to pauses. The tone shifted. Conversations deepened. Decisions became intentional, not just efficient. And for the first time, Eugene didn't feel like he was just building something bigger. He felt like he was building something that meant something. 2 weeks passed, then 3. He didn't count the days. Didn't wait in the way he once would have. Because waiting, he realized, wasn't about holding on to something. It was about continuing forward without needing immediate resolution. The morning she returned, it wasn't dramatic. No sudden realization. No overwhelming rush. Just a familiar chime of the cafe door. And a presence that felt known. Eugene looked up from his table. And there she was. Arya. Same quiet confidence. Same grounded energy. Different moment. She spotted him almost immediately. And for a second, they simply looked at each other. Not surprised. Not uncertain. Just aware. Then she walked over. You're still here, she said. Her tone was light, but there was something beneath it. Recognition. Eugene closed his book. I am. A small pause. She studied him more closely now, noticing, measuring. Not the suit because there wasn't one. Not the power because it wasn't being displayed. But him. You look different, she said. He considered that. I feel different, he replied. Aria's gaze softened slightly, not in sentiment, but in acknowledgement. Good different, she asked. Eugene thought about it. Not quickly. Not automatically. Just honestly.
Real, he said.
And that was the closest word he had. She sat across from him, without asking. This time, there was no boundary to test. No space to negotiate. Just ease. What did you do while I was gone? She asked, resting her chin lightly against her hand. Eugene glanced around the cafe, briefly. Then back at her. I stayed, he said. She smiled faintly. That's not an answer. It is, he replied. A pause. Then more clearly. I didn't try to replace the space you left. That caught her attention. Because most people did. They filled silence. Avoided stillness. Ran from absence. You just let it be? She asked. He nodded. Yes. Another pause. And I realized something, he continued. Arya waited. No interruption. No assumptions. Just space. Eugene leaned back slightly, his voice steady. I used to think no was something to overcome, he said. A barrier. A challenge. He met her eyes. But it's not. She didn't respond. Didn't need to. So he continued. It's clarity, he said. Direction. A choice. Aria's expression shifted, subtly but unmistakably, because he understood now. Not intellectually, but internally. And what do you do with that? She asked quietly. Eugene didn't hesitate this time. You respect it. The answer settled between them. Simple. Complete. True. They sat in silence for a moment. But it wasn't the same silence from before. This one. It wasn't filled with tension or uncertainty. It was grounded. Mutual. Earned. Arya studied him for a long second, then leaned back slightly. You changed, she said. Eugene shook his head faintly. Not completely, he replied. Just enough. She smiled at that. Because that was honest too. Real change didn't erase who you were. It refined it. Days turned into weeks again. But this time, the dynamic was different. They didn't meet every day. Didn't define what they were. Didn't rush toward anything. Some days, she said no to sitting with him. And he accepted it. Without question. Without resistance. Other days, they talked for hours. About life. Purpose. Fear. Freedom. Things that didn't have clean answers. Things that couldn't be controlled. And slowly, without either of them forcing it, something deeper formed. Not dependency. Not possession. But connection. Built on choice. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the cafe in warm gold, Arya gathered her things. I can't stay long tomorrow, she said casually. Eugene nodded. Okay. No disappointment. No pushback. Just acknowledgement. She paused, watching him. You're not going to ask why? She said. He shook his head slightly. You'll tell me if you want me to know. Her lips curved into a small smile. And there it was again. That quiet understanding. That balance. That respect. As she walked out, Eugene remained seated, his gaze drifting to the window. Not following. Not holding on. Just present. Because he understood now. She wasn't something to win. Or keep. Or define. She was someone who chose. Just like him. And that was the difference. Because once, he had everything. Power. Influence. Control. But none of it had taught him how to be chosen. Now, he didn't need to be everything. Didn't need to have all the answers. Didn't need the world to bend. Because he had learned something far more valuable than power. How to stand in a no. Without breaking. And how to receive a yes. Without taking it for granted. Eugene Park had spent his entire life building an empire. But it took one woman. One moment. One simple, unwavering word. To teach him how to build himself. And this time, it wasn't about control. It was about truth.